Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Politics Today, and in this programme today we'll be discussing the British government's response to the Iranian missile attack on Israel last weekend. And in this programme I'm joined by Pastor Chris Wickland from Living Word Church, together with Dr. Sarah Tun for Prayer for Parliament. So both of you, thank you so much for being my guests on this week's Politics Today. Chris, I'll start off with you. Please share your thoughts on the Iranian regime's attack on Israel last weekend that included drones, missiles, ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. In the end, it was believed that 350 were fired on Israel, on which the Israeli President Isaac Herzog said this was a declaration of war.
It is a declaration of war, and it's unprecedented. I've never, since I've been alive, ever seen Iran ever do anything quite like that. I mean, when I was growing up, we saw the Iran and Iraq war, but never anything like this. However, I think what Iran has done is also quite nuanced as well, in the sense of they know full well from what they saw from the 7th of October, that, you know, when they had 3,000 missiles coming in, the dome managed to protect Israel from a lot of those missiles. And so firing 300 missiles and drones, etc., I think was more of a political move from Iran, as well as a warning to Israel. Political in the sense of Hezbollah needs to know they've got their backing, and I guess Hamas needs to know that they're doing something as well. Because I think if Iran were really serious, they probably could have sent across a lot more firepower, but they gave them 72 hours notice that it was coming. And so what they did is unprecedented and is an act of war and an act of aggression, but still from a nuanced point of view, I think what Iran was doing was very political as well. Yeah,
but you could also argue that the fact that had these drones, had these cruise missiles or ballistic missiles hit Israel, then we're looking at thousands of casualties and so much damage that Israel would have declared war against Iran in self-response. So it's only by the grace of God and his protection that those rockets and missiles didn't go, as well as Israel's incredible technology. Sarah, great to see you back on Politics Today. Share with us how really essentially we saw God's hand of protection over Israel last weekend. The fact that Israel, together with this international coalition, together with the Saudis and the Jordanians, were able to intercept 99% of these rockets, missiles and drones that were targeted Israel last weekend.
He will keep his angels charge over you if you acknowledge him, right? I think it was God. I think it was an amazing thing. What resonates with me most, I think, is the unity. And I would hope that the Lord would be pleased with the unity amongst the allies. How good and pleasant it is, Psalm 133. But given the disunity that was growing, it's no wonder Iran thought, okay, now's the time, because the support that Israel had been receiving was being threatened to be removed. We in the UK were looking at whether or not we should continue to sell arms to them. That's absurd. Of course, Iran is going to hear that and measure that, factor that into everything that they do. So yes, I think God's hand is in it. And I think, in terms of prayer, we have been praying for a very long time for the UK government for truth to be exposed, and I think this exposes Iran.
Absolutely. And Chris, what are your thoughts on the fact that Rishi Sunak, our Prime Minister, deployed the Royal Air Force from bases in Cyprus to come to the defence of Israel against these Iranian rockets and missiles that were fired over the weekend?
Yeah, I think it's great that our nation stood alongside Israel for several reasons. Firstly, as a pastor, biblically, it's great to bless Israel because we get blessed in that as well. But politically, we need to remember that Israel is really the last bastion of Western civilization in the Middle East. And they're the only ones that are standing up for democracy and all the things that we enshrine and we value in culture and society. And yet around them, forgive me for saying this, but you have a trigger-happy dictatorial regime that want to see the likes of Israel and the West wiped off the map. So I think it's important that we stand with Israel and that we remain strong allies with them for that very reason.
And so the game changer seems to be that before the Iranian regime always deployed its proxies, whether they're Hamas or whether they're Palestinian Islamic Jihad or Hezbollah, or now increasingly the Houthis to carry out attacks on Israel. But this was a direct attack by the Iranian regime for the first time. Just share with us your thoughts about how the Iranians have come out of the shadow and decided to attack Israel without using their terror proxies.
I think it's two things. I think one is saber rattling, boys and their toys, which is not funny. I don't mean it in a funny way. It's horrendous. There's something else, though. I think that in doing this, what we start to see is Iran saying, "Okay, I'm going to play my cards. What are you going to do?" So it's trying to draw in the West. And does he want a war, or is he simply saying, how far do you dare go? Because I think he understands that the West doesn't want war, and that the extreme Islamic do. And so he's pushing all the buttons to see how many buttons can I press before the weak West back down.
So it's very good analysis, especially when you consider that the Iranians invented chess, and that's exactly what they're doing at the moment. And Chris, what would it take for the West to wake up to realize the seriousness of the threat that Iran poses, not only to Israel, but also to the West? And this time we saw that the Iranian regime fired conventional missiles. What happens next time if they fire those missiles with nuclear warheads?
Yeah, I think first of all, in answering that question with the nuclear warheads, I don't think Israel would allow them to even have anything nuclear. So I'm not sure if it would go that far. But in respect to what will it do to take our politicians to wake up, I think our nation is in a very precarious state right now geopolitically. It seems that we just have lots of leaders that are being bullied. We've seen what's happened in Parliament recently, where they were all kowtowing to basically death threats from Muslims, and what that did in Parliament. And so we've got a lot of scared, frightened politicians, and it seems that that's coming out. And we've got a similar situation to prior to the Second World War, where you had Neville Chamberlain, and they were like, well, I know Hitler's a bad guy, but what we'll do is we'll have some negotiations with him, we'll do some trade and stuff like this. Whereas Winston Churchill was like, no, if you don't deal with this bully in the playground, then it's just going to get worse and worse. And this is what worries me. I don't know if there's anyone in our political system at the moment, or certainly I'm not aware of any, who is going to be the next Churchill, because we are heading for, I think, another war. I think that's inevitable, what was going on with Russia, and we've got China rumbling and stuff, and what's going on in the Middle East. And I think war is coming. And so it's how you're going to navigate that, and we need brave politicians that can actually navigate. And I'm not altogether. I'm sure there are some out there, but certainly none with the profile that they need. And I think that's where we're at as a nation now. We need a Winston Churchill, not a Neville Chamberlain.
Well, we're saying that as well. I mean, the front page of the Telegraph for this recording is Ben Wallace, the former Defence Secretary, says the West must stand up to the Iranian bullies, and he's going against the rest of the Conservative Party in calling out David Cameron and Rishi Sunak for their policy of appeasement towards the Iranian regime, which brings me on nicely, Sarah, to I want to engage your response in terms of what David Cameron, our Foreign Secretary, has said. So according to my notes here, he has urged the Israeli government to walk back from the brink and not escalate the situation. He told the BBC that the UK advice is not to retaliate, and that Israel must think with its head and not its heart, that Israel has already is winning due to the lack of damage caused, and the West turning against Iran over its attack on the Jewish state. What are your thoughts on his comments and Britain's position regarding being attacked by the Iranian regime?
I think that Israel needs to respond, but not retaliate. That's my personal view. And I don't entirely agree with the script David Cameron gave, but surprisingly to me, and probably to you, I do agree in some principle. I think we're more at a Bay of Pigs moment than we are 1939. So Bay of Pigs was when Kennedy and Khrushchev nearly had World War III, Russia and America, in the early 61 or 62.
Okay, so the Bay of Pigs was the fiasco caused by the attempted coup of Castro in 60, would have been 61, that led then a year later to the Cuban Missile Crisis.
That's it. And I think we're more there than we are World War III. But what in the heart of it, I think, is what we need to do is whatever Israel decides to do, and we'll discuss that more, but whatever they decide to do, we need to back them. Now, there's nothing wrong with saying don't retaliate. There's nothing wrong, certainly, with saying don't take revenge. But I do think that whatever the response is, they will have to respond, but they could respond in quite a surprising way. And that's subject to prayer, and I don't know, I think given the questions, you probably want to wait for that. Excuse me, but I think respond rather than retaliate. And there is some I think there's some validity in what David Cameron said.
Chris, I just want to follow up with what Rishi Sunak, our Prime Minister, said in Parliament earlier in this week, and again reading my notes. He echoes calls by fellow world leaders for Israel to show restraint in response to the weekend's attack on Israel. And has said as the international community seeks to prevent a full-scale regional conflict, essentially this is capitulation, isn't it, to the Iranian regime, that the Rishi Sunak, David Cameron are running scared, saying, Israel, take your victory, even though it wasn't a victory. It was the miraculous hand of God that protected Israel. And any other nation that has faced 350 rockets and missiles fired at it is a declaration of war.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's just two words here, which is restraint versus deterrence. And so we are saying, you know, just back down, just keep calm. You kind of had a double win here, you know, because they've shown that actually they didn't really do much damage, and you've shown your military power, etc. And they're trying to smooth it out as a double win, but it isn't, and it's an attack. I mean, I was speaking to my wife about this the other day, and she said, look, you've got Israel, it's the size of Wales. Now let's just say, typically, let's say Wales overnight was attacked by Northern Ireland with over 350 rockets and stuff, and they managed to defend themselves. You know, that would be declared as an act of war. It is serious. And so I understand why our governments are saying, can you please have restraint? And I was watching Piers Morgan the other night, and he was saying, look, Israel are the grown-ups here. They're surrounded by trigger-happy totalitarian regimes. And he said maybe that Israel needs to show restraint and be the grown-ups. And so I see where he's coming from. So there is that process of restraint. But then there's also the point of deterrence as well, which is why I think that Israel will have to do something back. A bit again like the school bully, that, you know, if you just let him kick you around but you don't give him a bloody nose or a black eye, then he's just going to keep bothering you. And so I think Israel are going to have to do some kind of deterrence attack, targeted attack, so that Iran knows that they can't mess with these guys. Because I don't think it's good for anybody if this all goes out of control. You know, our politicians, they're concerned. You know, as I said earlier, our economy is shot to pieces. Everything's shot to pieces in this country right now, and same on a geopolitical level. And a war can just destabilize everything. Everything's hanging by a thread at the moment. And I think if Israel chooses to go to war, and this is bad for everybody, but at the same time, they do have to show strength to the bully.
Absolutely. And so we see that US President Joe Bedin is calling for restraint. We also see, for example, that he's also saying that he won't support Israel in any kind of retaliatory strikes against the Iranian regime. And is putting a lot of pressure on Israel. We see the same from Rishi Sunak and our Foreign Minister David Cameron, repeatedly in calls to Jerusalem to tell them to show restraint. But the reality is that America and Britain do not live in the Middle East. They haven't faced what Israel faced on October the 7th, what was nothing but a massacre, more Jews killed during that day than we've seen in over 80 years, and that was the Holocaust. We know the intentions behind the Iranian regime is to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. And when you look at the Middle East, it's only the strongest survive. So if Israel shows weakness in face of the hostility she's facing from Iran, then surely there's a great danger that we're going to see greater attacks against Israel, more rockets and missiles, this time more deadly, more terrorist attacks. So surely Israel has to respond to that Iranian aggression.
Number one, the interference that Joe Biden has done with the war between Israel and Gaza has provoked and allowed Iran to attack. If the Israelis had been allowed to do what they said they wanted to do in Rafah weeks ago, if they were allowed to go in on the ground forces months ago more quickly, there would have been no more casualties than there are, which is ratio 1-to-1, as opposed to in most wars, it's 5-to-1 or 10-to-1 civilians to. So Israel is fighting as compassionately as they can, but nevertheless, the Americans and the rest interfere. That interference is what is given license or given ammunition or encouragement or whatever word you want to use to Iran. And so I totally agree with both of you that listening to Joe Biden is only going to cause more problems. On the other hand, if the War Cabinet isn't more tactical, does what they believe they need to do, but tactically. So if they just fire bombs back, that's not going to work. If it were me, just sitting here thinking about it now, I hadn't thought about this before, I would threaten to nuke Iran. And I think that would stop things. But the point is that the West interference and lack of trust with their ally is creating the momentum amongst the Middle East. Well, I can't say Arabs. It's more complicated, but the regimes that are totalitarian. There are those that are friendly, so it's important to say that the Jordanians and the Saudis and various other, besides what we call the West, were very supportive. The Jordanians also intercepted missiles. But if America wants things to be verbal rather than literally physical, then Israel has to say something that is going to put people to silence.
Yeah, so I just want to respond to that because I think you raise a very important question. I mean, firstly, the Iranian regime knows that Israel has nuclear weapons. Secondly, the danger of Israel threatening the Iranian regime with nuclear weapons is it will trigger a response from the Russian and the Chinese, their allies, and then you're heading for a major nuclear confrontation. And I can't see Israel doing that at all, but that is a last resort. If the very threat of Israel is threatened and her very existence is threatened, then it's called the Samson option, which is part of Israeli policy as the last resort. And it's very similar to the Masada syndrome, where if you know the story of Masada in the revolt against the Romans, they decided to commit suicide rather than to surrender to the Romans. In the same way, Israel has that Samson option, but only use that as a last kind of resort. And I have to say, I pick on something that you said earlier in the program, Chris, and that's the lack of moral clarity that we're seeing in the West today. This failure to recognize evil. And when you look at the Iranian regime and its behavior ever since the regime came to power in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution, they have exported their revolution around the world. They are the largest state sponsor of international terrorism. They have the most appalling human rights records. They suppress their own people, particularly Christians. They are very much pursuing nuclear weapons for two reasons. One, to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. And if we learn anything from the Second World War, it's to believe what dictators say. If they say they are going to destroy Israel, then they will, and it's knowing their intentions. So what is it that the West fails to see when looking at this Iranian regime and how this decades of appeasement over the Iranian regime has not worked, but instead they've got more dangerous, as we've seen last weekend, firing these rockets and missiles over to Israel.
Yeah, I think simply put, it's culture. We are judging them through the lens of our liberal government and all the years that we've had as we've developed as a nation and as Europe, etc. And so we're coming at them as though they're reasonable people. You know, we can reason. You know, we'll give you what you want, you give us what we want, we'll all be happy. But the trouble is, this is a West versus East philosophy, and some parts of the East, as I've said many times, it's a dictatorial, totalitarian mindset, and they're laughing at us. They're mocking us. It's like, oh, we'll be your friend and we'll give you this and we'll do that. You know, when the Obama administration let them start, you know, with their nuclear power and stuff, everybody knew what they would do with it. But again, and you know, they went along with it, but then they showed their colours, and now we're seeing their colours again with Iran. And unfortunately, this is why I'm saying, although I agree with you at this Bay of Pigs moment, if this is not put in check, then we are heading for something quite serious, because it's only a matter of time before someone says, you know, you've crossed a line now, this far and no further. Because it's only a matter of time, because we've always said this, and you've said this on your show, that if people attack Israel, it's only a matter of time before it comes to us. And Israel are holding back. They're the only guys holding back that regime from coming across Europe and coming into our nation and stuff. And so we need Israel. We need to be allied with them. And again, we need politicians that can actually see this and stop having this kind of wishy-washy liberal mindset, and actually see that we're dealing with totalitarian mindset here, and therefore we've got to fight fire with fire a little bit here, so that they respect us and they back off.
Absolutely.
It's like they play politics, but they don't realize that what Iran is saying is they actually mean it. They don't realize that what Hamas is saying, they actually mean it. They play politics so much, and they don't mean what they say, that they think everybody else is the same. So the cultural difference isn't even, it's everything that what you said, but it even spills into the political arena. Their way of doing politics, they're I don't know, if Iran's playing chess, they're playing backgammon.
Absolutely. That's a good description. And of course, the West made that same mistake in the 1930s, saying that Hitler didn't mean what he said. He didn't mean what he wrote in Mein Kampf. And yet we see that he launched the Second World War, launched the Holocaust, the final solution, to murder the Jewish people on an industrial scale. He meant what he said. He wrote it in a book, the same way the Iranian regime actually then says that they will want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Means they want to do it, but they call Israel the little Satan and America the big Satan. So if, for example, America's not protecting Israel, then America's also in danger from the Iranian regime. So surely there is, and diplomacy doesn't work unless it's backed up by force. And this is something we're seeing an absolute failure on behalf of the Biden administration to use American power effectively to keep the world as a safer place. Do you think that this is going to have a big impact on Joe Biden's hopes for a re-election come November the 24th? Because he's seen increasingly being weak on the world stage, and this is endangering not only America but also the entire Western world.
I think we need to pray. I think we need to pray that America sees things differently from Joe Biden, because Joe Biden is, well, he's playing tiddlywinks, sorry to carry on the analogy, but he thinks he's got power and he has none. The power that he actually has in the office he's not using, he's misusing. And so will it make him weaker? I don't know. I think it depends on the population in America, whether they're looking at, we have to crush these regimes that are seeking to attack the West, some will say, but others will be just as naive as the politicians. And, oh, we must, if we're nice to them long enough, they'll get it and they'll be our friends.
Yeah. And Chris, I mean, Israel's never faced anything like she's facing now since October the 7th, and now this rocket and missile attack on Israel, which is unprecedented in Israel's modern history. Share with us from a biblical perspective why it's vital that Christians stand with Israel and the Jewish people during these dark and dangerous times.
I think at this time, and this is what concerns me, so I'm seeing things through the lens of a pastor here. So I know that probably 70 to 80% of the churches in the UK are not pro-Israel at all, and are a replacement in their theology. And so this is what I think is very dangerous, because there's a bigger game plan going on here. Not what's going on in the Middle East, but there's a bigger game plan going on, which is God's agenda as well for the Middle East, and obviously the return of Messiah. And if Christians don't understand the biblical importance of Israel, more so in these days than any other time, the church won't be awake to address the issues that are going on. And I find, it's like Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He said to his disciples, look, will you watch and while you pray, while Jesus was going through the most intense part of his life. And we're coming up to the exact same situation in the world, where we're coming up to the darkest days in history, and the church should be watching and the church should be praying, but she's not, she's fast asleep. And so I think at this hour, and I would call upon all church leaders that are pro-Israel, etc., to really hammer that message to the congregation. It's like, you are living in the end of days, and you need to wake up to the signs of the times. And Israel is one of the most important singular end time events, and everything revolves around it. The book of Revelation, it's all about Israel. It's a tale of two cities, as they say. It's about Babylon and Israel. And I think in these days that the church needs to really wake up to what's going on, because if she doesn't, I fear that she's going to support the wrong side and wake up in a whole world of trouble. And she should be watching and praying, and she's not.
Absolutely. And so as an intercessor, how should our viewers be praying at this very critical time, particularly as we see that Israel is facing increasing dangers ever since October the 7th. Israel's security situation is becoming more precarious. We're seeing an emboldened Iranian regime, and we're also seeing incredible weakness on behalf of Israel's allies in the West, namely the United States, to take the bold action needed in order to bring peace and stability to the most dangerous region of the world, that is the Middle East.
Yes, I think personally I'd like to pray God's will be done, and if that means that there's a regime change in Iran, which would the citizens of Iran would welcome, and they mustn't be forgotten. I said threaten nuclear war. I did say threaten, don't actually do it. But, obviously that's terrifying, and the Iranian people will be terrified right now just knowing what their regime has done to Israel, and what will Israel, how it will Israel respond. So pray God's will. Also, I would pray that the war cabinet in Israel, that includes Benjamin Netanyahu, but others as well, that they operate out of courage but not pride, and because the two can be very lined up, that they operate out of courage, and that they recognize, from a spiritual perspective, they recognize God's grace and mercy, as we as believers would hope they would, but also they recognize the value of grace and mercy. So I know that there's a nuance, but and there's a difference here, but somehow we need to find, and Israel needs to find God's way through this.
Absolutely. So Sarah and Chris, thank you so much for being my guests on this week's edition of Politics Day. Done a great job, thank you. And I want to thank you for watching the programme at home. Our leaders in the UK, certainly David Cameron and Rishi Sunak, need to understand that if you touch the apple of God's eye, God touches you. And so it's imperative that our nation stands with Israel during these difficult and dark times. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Politics Today.